Making requests to ChatGPT and getting a response back isn't too tricky, particularly when you use something like the OpenAI PHP client. But we're going to take this a little step further and look at streamed responses and also maintaining conversation context. So if I tell this bot something, it's going to go ahead and remember what I say. Let's go ahead and try this out. So the way that I've set up the prompt here is that it is a friendly bot who will help with any kind of web development problems. So let's go ahead and just say, hey. Okay, so we're going to wait here, and you can see that the response here is streamed in. Rather than waiting for that huge length of time for everything to come back, it will give this to us as it kind of types. Okay, so I'm just going to say, link me to the Laravel docs, and we'll just wait for here, and you can see that streaming in. It gives us the link. We don't have markdown or anything like this enabled here, so we can't click on this, but we can easily add that in later. Okay, so I'm going to ask this to remember something. So my name is Alex, and it should respond with something, and I'm just going to ask it what my name is. So what is my name? And there we go. Great. So this doesn't happen by default when we send requests to the API, because of course we send a request off, we get a response back. We don't maintain any kind of context within the conversation history. So we're going to be adding that in as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and build this. We're going to learn a huge amount about wire stream, which is incredibly useful for other situations as well. So you can go ahead and use that for anything where you have streamed content. Okay, let's go over and get everything set up and start to build this out. Okay, so we're starting off here with a completely fresh project with Livewire pulled in. And the first thing that we want to do is head over and get OpenAI installed and set up. So we've got a PHP client here, which we can use to connect using our project API keys. So let's start with this first of all. If you haven't already, go ahead and sign up for an account here, and you'll be able to come into this API section and start to manage your projects. So what I'm going to do is go over to a project that I've already created for this, but if not, go ahead and hit create project, give it a name, and you'll be booted into that. So let's head over to this Livewire chat project, and as you can see, I've got no API keys just yet. Let's go ahead and create one now, and then we'll put this immediately into our Laravel project. Okay, so we'll go ahead and just set this under this project. We'll give all permissions, and we'll create this secret key. Okay, so this will be given to us and it won't be shown again. So we need to make sure that we copy this first of all, and we're going to head over to our project. We're going to go straight over to our env directory. We'll come all the way down here and we'll create out an OpenAI secret environment variable, and we'll put that in there. Okay, before we do anything else, let's create some config for this so we don't have to read directly from env. So I'm going to go into our config directory. And let's create out a new PHP file in here called openai.php, and we'll just basically return an array here with the secret that we've just defined in here, and then we can easily access this. So that's OpenAI and secret. Great. Okay, so next up is going ahead and actually installing a client so we can make requests here. Let's go ahead and pull this in. We'll bind it to our container. We'll make an example request just to see that this is working, and then we're good to go. So let's come over to our project, and we're going to require this in, of course, with Composer. Now, while that's finishing, let's just go over to our app service provider, and under this register area, we can go ahead and just bind this to our container. So let's go into our app. We'll just register this as a singleton called OpenAI. And then inside of this closure, we'll just boot this up and return it. So let's go ahead and use OpenAI here and client. And let's go ahead and pass in our key. So let's say config, and we've just created that file out. It's OpenAI and then .secret. Okay, let's make an example request just over in our web routes. We'll just keep this simple. So let's go ahead and create out a response variable here. We'll go ahead and fetch the OpenAI item out of our container, and then we can just start to make a request. So since we're dealing with chat, we're going to go ahead and call chat here, and then we're just going to call create. Now later on, we're going to be using create streamed because we're going to want a streamed response. What will happen here when we send this request through is it will take a little bit of time to come back because we're not going to get it in those chunks that we expect within a chat interface. Okay, so inside of here, we need to pass two things. First of all, the model. So depending on when you're watching this, it could change. I'm going to choose GPT-4. And then we have a bunch of messages that we want to send across. So what we can do in here is create out a nested array. And the first thing that we're going to define is the role. So role here could be system, and we'll go ahead and give this some content. And we're going to do something like you are a friendly bot to help with web development, something like that. That just gives this an idea of what it needs to do. Then what we can do is change the role over to user, and then we can go ahead and pass a response in. So both of these things will be sent over. The context here will be defined, and then we will ask a question within this user role. So link me to the Laravel docs, and let's just leave it at that and see what we get back when we make a request to this. So let's die dump on the response and see what comes back. Okay, let's head over to the browser. We're going to give this a refresh, and obviously it's going to take a little while because the entire response is coming back here. And let's go over to this choices array and see what this contains. So we've got a created response choice, and we've got message here, and there we go. Yeah, sure enough, the assistant, which is another role, has given us the content. Sure, here is the link to the Laravel documentation. So super easy to send a request and get it back. But of course, we don't want to be waiting a huge amount of time for the entire response to come back, which is the entire point of this course. So now that we've done that, let's go over and start to get our chat interface built up, and we can send these requests in a slightly different way. Let's start out with creating our chat interface and have our messages pushed to an array so they can be displayed. And then we'll look at how we trigger OpenAI to give us back a response when that happens. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and create out a Livewire component. So let's go ahead and call this chat. And because we're going to be registering this as a full page component, let's also go ahead and generate out a default layout here. Okay, let's go ahead and swap this over for that chat component that we've just created. And let's open up our layout and just make sure that we have Vite pulling in our CSS so we can get Tailwind in. So we're going to go into resources, app, and app.css. And while we're here, let's just go ahead and change this page title over to pull this from our app's name. Okay, so we should now have a layout, and we can just start to put this onto the page. So if we head over to our chat.blade.php file, I have some pre-made markup here for the entire chat, which you can grab from the GitHub repo. So if we go over to that and have a look, you can see it looks like this. Sure enough, exactly what we saw from the introduction. So we can type something in here. We see each of the messages as they come through. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's head over to the actual chat component class. Let's define out some of the things that we know we're going to need here. The first thing is going to be the body that we want to send, which will be validated, of course. So just while we're here, let's go ahead and add in the validation rules for the body. Of course, this is going to be required. We'll make this a string, and we'll set a max here of 1,000, although string we don't really necessarily need. Okay, so the next thing is going to be the stack of messages that we are keeping track of. We're not storing these in the database, although you could. We're just having an array, a simple array of messages just inside of here. So let's define that out as well. Okay, now let's go and create a send method in here, which is going to be triggered when that form gets submitted. We want to validate everything, and then we want to start to push everything to those messages. So if we go over to chat.blade.php, let's go down to the form section just here. And let's hook up this input with wire model to that body property that we created. And then when this form gets submitted, we can go ahead and invoke send. So let's say wire submit, and we'll invoke send. Okay, that should be enough now to start to push that to our stack of messages. So what we're going to do here is add these messages as we would send the response through to OpenAI, as we saw from the last episode. So we're going to do something like this. We'll say this messages, and we'll push on another array into here, and we'll set the role. So the role here is going to be the user, which we've already seen, and we'll set the content here to, of course, the body directly within this component. What we're then going to do is down here, push the role as assistant to an empty bit of content, and that will eventually trigger an OpenAI response. Now, I'm not going to do that just yet. Let's go ahead and sort of ignore this for now. We'll in fact get rid of the entire thing. We'll cover that when we get to the point of actually going ahead and sending the request through. So I'm going to go ahead and reset the body, of course, because we don't want that to hang around in the form. And we now have a bunch of messages. So over in our chat template, let's go ahead and start to iterate through here. So this is the bot message. Again, I'm going to go ahead and comment that out for now. And this is what we want to start to iterate over. So let's do a for each here on each of our messages as message. And we want to check the role type here and we want to respond accordingly. This is eventually going to be a sub component which will trigger a response to OpenAI, and that will allow us to stream the content within its own Livewire component. So in here, we're going to say if the message role is user, then we want to go ahead and show this one. So let's end the if statement there, and then we'll add an else a little bit later when we get round to it. So here, of course, we just want to output the message content. Okay, let's see if this works, and then I'll give you a little bit more context around why we're doing this. So let's go ahead and just type hey, and yep, we just need to fix that up. And let's type hey again. And yeah, there we go. So we can just type as many messages as we want. And of course, they're all going to come through. So the reason that we're doing this is because when we use wire stream, it's going to work within its own component. We can stream to a single component, but we can't keep streaming within a loop here. We'll see that a little bit later. And the reason that over in chat we're pushing these messages is because eventually we want the context to be sent through to OpenAI as we add more messages. So now that we've done this and we've got a working chat just over here, let's go ahead and look at triggering a response back from OpenAI. As I mentioned in the last episode, whenever one of these messages has a role of assistant and the content is empty, what we then want to do is render a Livewire component, which in its mount method will start to trigger a response. And this isn't quite going to work how we want at the moment. We're going to switch this over to wire stream after we've done a little bit of digging and see how this works. But let's go ahead and push this after we have sent a message, and let's add this to our stack over in chat. So in here, we're just going to basically copy the entire if statement and that out here. And let's go and have a look at what we need to output. So it's just all of this stuff in here. So let's pull all of this into here. And there we go. This is going to be assistant. So at the moment, if we just type hey, it's automatically going to respond with what we have put in there, of course, but we don't have any content inside of here just yet. So what we're going to do is break this up into a separate component. So the component's job here is to make a request to the OpenAI API, and then the job is to stream this in. So I'm going to go ahead and cut all of this out, and let's create out a new component. So let's make out a chat response component, which is specifically for OpenAI. And let's go ahead and register this just in here, or output this in here. So let's say chat response, and let's just open this up for now over here and just paste all of that content in. So we shouldn't see any difference here. If we just type hey, we get exactly the same thing back. So inside of the main chat that we already have where we're outputting this, let's think about the kind of data that we need to pass down here. The first thing that we need, because we're outputting a component here, is a key, so a wire key. And we're just going to set this to the key that we get back from this array, since we're not working with anything within the database. That should fix any hydration issues. The next thing, and the really important thing we want to do, is send through a prompt. So where does this prompt come from? Okay, so this isn't the best solution, but let's go ahead and just grab the messages that we already have, and let's grab the key that we're currently iterating through -1. So that's going to give us, if we come back over to chat, the last message that was sent by the user. Of course, we could do some fancy filtering here if we wanted to, and that would make it a little bit easier. Okay, let's go and just fix that up. So we don't need this messages. We can just say messages key, and let's go over to our chat response component here and pick up this prompt. So let's say we've got our prompt in here, which might be an empty array. And let's go and just duplicate the response down to the chat response here. So let's output that prompt just to make sure everything is hooking up. Okay, so I'm going to say hey, and it basically should just repeat what I have. Okay, so can I assign array to property prompt? Yeah, of course. So over in our chat response here, prompt is actually an array, isn't it? That's the array with the role and the content. So let's just adjust this accordingly and say prompt content. And let's head over, type hey, and yeah, it just repeats everything that we say, which is fine for now. Okay, so we'll take a look at just sending a standard response to OpenAI, and then we will convert this over to Wirestream once we've done some digging. So I'm just going to create out a get response method in here, which we can invoke, and we'll invoke this from our mount method, but we'll change this up to use Wirestream a little bit later. And let's just do exactly what we have done before. So let's go and grab out OpenAI from our container. Let's use chat. Let's use create. And we want to start to send through any of the properties that we need, like the model. So let's say GPT-4, and we want to send the messages through. So we don't have these at the moment. So it would be good to grab through all of the messages inside of here as well. So let's go ahead and grab out the messages, and we'll head over to chat here, and we'll just pass all of their messages through so we can read them. Okay, great. So over in chat response now, we can just pass this messages through. And this kind of ties into how we're going to keep context, because our messages are always going to contain all of the previous messages that have been sent. So that's going to work really nicely. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and die dump on this response here. And what we want to do, at least initially, we're not going to end up doing this, is within the mount lifecycle hook within Livewire, just go ahead and invoke get response. So just to recap, the prompt gets sent through, the messages get sent through. When this component mounts, so within that array that we're iterating through, it will go ahead and call get response, and it will send a request off. So let's try this out. Let's say, hey, and we'll just wait a little while, and there we go. We get a response back. There's a little bit of a delay, which is why we're going to use streamed responses, but at least we know that we're triggering a request over here. And yeah, sure enough, we get a response back. So from here, what we could technically do is when this component mounts, we could go and read the message directly within here, and we could put it into the content of this component, which is each of the responses back from OpenAI. But we know that that is going to be super slow. Let's go ahead and do it anyway, just to see what this experience is like, and then we'll switch this over, as I've said before, to Wirestream. Okay, so let's go ahead and grab out the first item from choices here, and we'll convert this over to an array. Let's go back over and just type hey, and let's see what happens. And yeah, sure enough, we get the message back in here, and we get the content of that message. And you can see that we've got the role and the content as well. So in here, what we could do is grab out the message, and we could grab the content directly from here, and that should give us back the actual response. So if we were to do this in the standard way and have to wait for things, what we could do is create some sort of response variable inside of this component. So let's just do that really quickly just to see what this looks like. So let's create out this response property, and under chat response, let's just dump the response directly out here. Okay, if we head over and I say, hey, sure enough, it takes a little while for this request to go through, and I could say link me to the Livewire docs, which will probably be out of date. And you can see it takes an incredible amount of time because we're not streaming this. It's working, which is great, so we can improve on this. But as you can see, it's not the best experience. Now, one thing that we can do inside of here, just before we move on, is set a kind of base system message, which we saw before. So if we go ahead and open up our main chat component, what we could do is when this component mounts, we could push to our messages, which get sent through to that component, which will always contain a system message. So we can go ahead and take this and say system, and in content, we can give it sort of an initial prompt. So you are a friendly web developer here to help. We could even say something like always start the conversation with hey, for example. So let's go over and see if this works. Let's say hey, and there we go. You can see that it will always start with hey inside of here. We're not going to do that, but that just gives you an idea of how you can set up that initial prompt to do what you need. Okay, so let's go ahead and get rid of that, and we'll just keep it at this for now. Let's go off track for a little bit and talk about how Wirestream works with a really simple counterexample that you can find directly on the Livewire docs, and then you can refer back to it if you need to. Okay, let's go ahead and create out a simple component here and test this out. So we're going to go ahead and make out a counter component. Let's go over to our roots and let's register this out as counter. Swap this over to our counter, and we should be good. Okay, so let's go over to this in the browser, and obviously we don't see anything just yet. So what are we going to do here? Well, we want to create out, we'll start with our counter template, a counter in here that maybe starts at 5 or 10, and then a button to start this counter. Now, what we want to do is see this decrement until it gets to 0, of course. It's going to be a countdown. But what we want to do is do this in a single network request. So if you think back to our chatbot, we're going to get this content streamed in pieces. It will be a few words at a time. And we want to display this on the page as that content actually rolls in. What we don't want to do is continue to send network requests over in here to Livewire to get these back. It's not great practice to just constantly poll this if you don't need to. And that's where wire stream comes in. Okay, so let's go ahead and build out this full example. So let's create this button to click, and we'll just say start. Let's go over to our counter, and we'll create our this start here. And let's create a counter up here, which starts at a specific value. This is going to start the countdown. And then, of course, over here, we can grab out that counter value. So at the moment, looks like that. When we click that, it invokes that method. So here's what we typically do. Let's create out a while loop in here. And the condition of this is going to be that these counter here is greater than or equal to 0. What do we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and sleep for a second. And then we want to set the counter to the current counter value -1, or just do minus, and see what happens. So let's go over, hit start, and yeah, sure enough, nothing is happening. This is happening behind the scenes, and of course, it's not updating. So what we want to do is stream the value of counter directly to an element on the page. So to do this, inside of here, we're going to say this stream, and this takes a couple of options. The first one is the element that this goes to. So let's bring in named arguments here to make it a little bit easier. The second one is going to be the content, which is going to be the counter itself, of course, because that's what we want to see. And then we have a second option, which I think by default is true, which is replace. Do we want to replace this or add on to it? And actually, no, the default of this is false, because we do want to append. This will append the value, and this will replace the value. So let's start with replace as false, because that's what we're going to be using for our chat. Okay, so is this going to make any difference? The answer is not really, because we are not outputting the streamed content to the page. So let's go over to our counter component, and in here, we're going to change this over to wire stream. Now, what do we call that? If we have a look, we call this count. So let's go and reference count here. And then we just want to output the current value of the counter. All right, let's try this out. I'm going to hit start. And yeah, sure enough, what's happening now is that's counting down. Because I set replace to false, it is just appending onto this. But of course, once we change this back over, it will work. So you can see that is working now. And we end up at -1, but you know, who cares? We are just looking at a simple example here. So let's go ahead and say true. And let's actually switch this over to just greater than. And let's try this out. So I'm going to hit star. And yeah, it starts counting down. Obviously, because we've chosen a lower number, let's just wait for it to get all the way down to 0. And there we go. Perfect. So if we open up our network tab here, what you'll notice, if we just look at all here, when I do click on this, you'll see that we do send a single request to Livewire, but then Livewire is going to use that stream API to continue to stream this request down. So we're not making a bunch of network requests over and over again. It's also a lot more convenient to use Wirestream because we don't need to set up any kind of mechanism to constantly reload this component. And if we did reload the component and there was other data in there that was being fetched, maybe from the database or even an API request, that would continue to, of course, go ahead and make request, and it would slow everything down. Okay, so now that we have looked at a really simple counter example, let's go ahead and apply this to our chat response component, because we want to take the response that we get back here and we want to create a streamed response and then append all of them pieces of data to the chat bubble. Let's apply what we've learned about Wirestream to our chat response, and then we'll try and stream this to these individual chat response components. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is instead of use create, we want to use create stream. That's going to give us a different result back. And of course, this will be a stream that we can iterate through and then stream to our template. So I'm going to get rid of this response here, and let's just die dump on this response to see what we've got. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say, hey, and we'll just wait for that to come back. And as you can see, the response here, we have got a stream, and then inside of here, we can start to read that data. So what do we want to do here? Well, let's go ahead and just rename this to stream. We want to iterate over each of the pieces of this stream. So I'm just going to call that as response. Let's just go ahead and clear out our Laravel log and just log these two here just to see what we've got out of interest. So we're going to go ahead and log some content of this. Let's go ahead and pluck this out first of all. So let's use our array helper here to grab the response choices as we did before. So this is exactly the same. And then we have delta and content. Let's log this out and see what happens. So Laravel log is clear. Let's go over and let's write hey. Okay, there we go. So we've got a response complete now. If we head over here, you can see that each of these pieces has come through. In fact, each of these is just a single word. So now with each of these, much like the counter that we created, imagining these are numbers, we can just output each of these words as they come in and stream them to the front end. So let's try this out. Let's say this stream, and again, we'll make use of named arguments to make this a little bit easier. Where do we want to stream this to? Well, let's just stream it to something called stream for now. We will go ahead and set replace to false because we want this to append on, although we can just ignore that because that is the default. And of course, really importantly, the content is the content just here. Let's switch this over to Wirestream. We know that stream is called stream, and we want to output the response. Okay, so let's head over and see if this now actually streams properly. Okay, great. So you could see that that did, and then sort of went away at the end. Now we can kind of get around this by going ahead and setting the response that we already had floating around from earlier to a concatenated version of that content. And then once everything is done, so after the for each happens, we will already have that response in there, and we could just output that directly within our content. So if we go over to our chat response here, this response is already being output. It's being streamed, but then we'll have the concatenated version at the end. So let's say hey, and wait for the response back. And yeah, let's just make sure we set this to a null value. And we should be good. So let's say hey. And there we go. So that stays. So it ends up with a fully constructed version that stays in there. All right, let's send another message and see if everything is good. So link me to the Livewire docs, for example. And as you can see, we've got a little bit of an issue here. So what's happening is because we're rendering multiple components, each with their own stream, each of them streams have their own name. So over in the chat response here, we've just called this stream. Now that means that two of these exist within our overall page. And as we write more content, they are just going to end up adding on to each of them, which is not great. So we can solve this very, very easily with a unique ID. So what do we do? Well, let's go over to our chat response first of all. And over here, let's say stream 2. And what we could do is we could just use the ID of the component. So let's just say this get ID. That will grab the ID of the component for us. And we can do exactly the same thing over in our chat response here. And we could just add on this get ID and we're done. So that now makes that stream unique to that individual component or chat bubble. Let's try again. So I'm going to say, hey, and yep, we get that back. Link me to the Livewire docs, and there we go. So it's now being streamed to its own individual component.